So, TEAC 8B is over taxonomy and classification. We use this PowerPoint in class, but I'm going to go ahead and use it again to review or reteach this. So taxonomy is the science of defining groups based on shared characteristics. Scientific names are used so that we can be sure in the animal or plant or whatever we're talking about, that we're talking about the same thing. And so we normally say a pill bug and a roly-poly because they're the exact same thing, but if you're talking to someone from New York and you say a roly-poly, they're going to think we're talking about some random type of insect here in Texas that they've never seen, ever heard of. And so we would have to use the scientific name or one of the shortened versions, hint, hint, of the scientific name in order to make sure we were talking about the same animal. So, like this, each of these birds is called a robin where they live, and these common names are confusing, but if you look at the scientific names, it makes it clear that we're talking about two different species. So, like I said, common names, robin and robin. If you're talking to somebody in Europe, they're thinking about this bird, and we're thinking about this bird. Okay, and so that's why we must look at the scientific names. You may not think it's that important, but if you really like birds, it makes a difference because a robin is not a robin everywhere. So domains are the largest taxonomic group, which means they have the most organisms in them because there's only 3 domains, but there's millions of species. These 3 domains are eukarya or eukaryota. These are everything that has a nucleus in their cell. Eubacteria, or what we used to just call bacteria. These are the newer bacteria. These are the ones that are either really bad, really helpful, or just live in really normal plain areas. And then your third domain is archaea. Archaea comes from the same term as archaic. So these are the really old life forms of bacteria. These go back to when the earth was still almost all volcanoes with very little water and sulfuric gas and salt and acid just everywhere. And so these bacteria survived that and kept those characteristics. Now, to be in the domain eukarya, you must be made of eukaryotic cells, which means you have to have nucleuses or nuclei in your cells. Kingdom comes after domain, and it is the next largest category. Organisms in each kingdom have some basic characteristics in common, but they can also have differences. So if you're looking at plants, one of the common things in kingdom Plantae is that they have cellulose in their cell walls. Fungi, mushrooms particularly, they can be classified because in their cell walls they have chitin. And so those are 2 small ways that you can separate fungi and plants. So the animal kingdom is in domain eukarya because animals are eukaryotes. We have a nucleus. They also have other things that make animals more common. Okay, so all animals are multicellular. As you'll look at these pictures, they all take more than one cell to form. All animals are heterotrophic. Remember, hetero means different, and these must eat something different to get energy. And all animals move. There is, with exception, there are very few animals that spend most of their life sitting still. And so we think of migration and how much animals move for that. And then like little fish here, they just swim in and out all the time. They move. And then from kingdom, we break down even further into phylum, which we call phyla when we say the plural. And all vertebrates are in phylum Chordata. So already we know we're in domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata. And so phylum Chordata is animals, kingdom Animalia, animals that have a backbone. And so this would be still pretty broad because we know we're talking about animals, but now we're talking about animals with a backbone. And so as we go down, we get more specific and we weed out or we get rid of more options or other options. So the members of phylum Arthropoda are also members of the animal kingdom. So kingdom Animalia, phylum Arthropoda. They have been placed together into the same phylum because they all have jointed legs. So you'll see you got a little leg joint right here. You have a leg joint right here. You have a leg joint right here, right here, right here. These little guys right here, right here, right here, and right there. Okay. They have segmented bodies, so you'll see we have lots of little stacked of segments there. We have stacks of segments here. We have a few segment parts, but really we have one big one, two, and then a third one that's the head right there. You have your crab, main crab, and then you have these little pieces coming out. And then with your spiders, you have an abdomen and a head, and then the legs. And then exoskeletons. Everyone up here crunches when you step on them. This one you may have to use a hammer, right? But their skeleton is on the outside. So they have like an armor plating that works as their skeleton. It just, instead of being in their bodies with muscle and everything around it, it is around their bodies with muscle attached to it. Each phylum is then divided up into classes. And remember, these are the animal groups that you used to do when you were a kid. You knew what a reptile was, an amphibian, a mammal, a bird, and a fish. Okay, so those are your classes in the animal kingdom. So what do all these reptiles have in common? Well, they have scaly skin. They have forearms and back arms, and they have tails, except for our snakes here. So that would tell us they're a little less related to this guy, and they're super less related to these two as a total. These guys are more closely related because they have similar eye structures, they have similar leg, and then they both have that little ear hole right there. And so when you go back to natural selection or common ancestry, that's homologous structures right there. And so that's why these guys are put in the same class, because they're closely related. And they're more closely related to each other than they may be to birds, right? Birds have backbones, so they're chordate still, but their class is Aves. And so reptiles and birds are in the same phylum, but their classes are different because they both have backbones. Then you have mammals, which are class Mammalia. Welcome to you. You are Eukarya, Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia. And then insects, still Eukarya, still Animalia, but now the phylum is Arthropoda and the class is Insecta. See the phylum? They're not a chordate, so we have a different phylum, which means we also have to have a different class. Even though classes seem pretty specific, we're still getting more and more specific, and classes are broken down into orders. And it's just one more way to say, hey, this is more like this than it is like this other guy. And so we're breaking down these classes into a little more specific orders. And orders can be based on an insects. They can be based on wing shape, wing type, if they can be collapsed, if they're a compound wing, which means they have two wings, And so that's what actually would use to classify for order. Each order is placed into families. These families often have more similarities than differences, right? Because when you look at the order, that is a broader group. And so I may not be related as well to something in my order, but I'll be more closely related to something in my family. So, domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia. So from here, you have eukaryotic cells. They're an animal. They have a backbone. They're a mammal. And now I know they're carnivorous, which means they eat meat. And their family is Felidae, or Felidae, which means they're probably in a feline family. And then within families, the most closely related species are those placed into the genus, because you cannot get more specific than a species. You have a species of zebra, but you have a genus that is similar to horses. Equus means horse in Latin. So that tells me this genus is Equus, and so they're closely related, but they can't be the same species because they're two different organisms. They're two different species, and you can tell just by looking at them. They're similar, that's why they're in the same genus, but they're not the same thing. That's why they're not the same species. And so each organism's name or specific epithet, or how you write the species name. You don't have to go Eukaryota, Animalia, blah, 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 blah. You just go genus, species. What's the genus? What's the species? So for a gray wolf, you'll see it says Canis lupus. Canis is the genus. Lupus is the species. So you can write Canis lupus, or you can write C. lupus. And those both work as the name for that species. So remember that this genus tells me they are more closely related than, let me go back here, right? Because those are just regular house cats. And so they're not as closely related, because after Felidae, the genus is different. So when you go back here, these are more closely related because they have the same genus, just like those two horses. And these are both house cats. So let's look at these two questions really quick. What I always tell people is that word right there, that Canis familiaris, and things like that, you don't have to know how to say that. Like, don't even bother. It doesn't matter. All you need to do is look at the words and see if they're similar. So, which are most closely related genetically, right? Canis familiaris. I cannot find another dog in the same species and it be closely related. It's the exact same thing. And so the next word I'm going to look for is Canis. That is the only one with Canis in the name. And if it said Ursus familiaris, that's what they would do, is they'd try to trick you and make you think this has to be the same word. Now over here, we are going to look at a relationship. So we want to see the scientific name. American bobtails, or Felis catus, are a breed of domestic cat. Which one is most closely related? Well, I'm going to go first to the Felis. It must be Felis catus, because you cannot get more closely related than the exact same thing. So, we have been saying several versions of this. Dear King Philip, come over for good soup. Did King Philip come over for grape soda? But all we're doing with that is we're creating what we fancy people call a mnemonic to help you remember the order of specificity, right? Domains are extremely broad, and so you can be in the same domain and be completely unrelated to each other.